My name is Claire Ann Thompson. I'm 52 years old, and I live in a small, weathered house on the east side of Cincinnati, the kind of neighborhood where you can still tell the history of a family by the porch swing and the chipped mailbox. I work part-time at the downtown library shelving the biographies I never quite finished reading, and I drive the same creaky Honda that has a dent the size of a fist on the passenger door. I moved into this house when Maya was 5 and her father left. For a long time I thought moving in meant moving on. It didn't. For most of my life I've been the woman who made her children's lunches, who stayed late to wash the sticky dishes, who pretended the quiet was normal. Lately that pretense has been cracking. Inside me there is a chronic ache I cannot name without trembling. Guilt, shame, a slow-burning regret for the things I saw and let be. Before I dive any further, if you listen to real stories that sting, please consider subscribing. I don't tell this easily. If there's a single person who hears it and feels less alone, then it will be worth something. You'll watch from the couch, Maya told me 3 nights ago. She said it like it was a small mathematical fact, like asking me to pass the salt. The tone had a flatness that I recognized. It was the same voice she used in college when she wanted absolutes, when she needed to be in control because everything else had been chaotic for so long. We were in the kitchen. The light above the sink hummed and licked at the water streaks on the window. Outside, it was one of those late November evenings when the air tastes like metal and the wind moves in a way that makes bare branches scrape like fingernails against the siding. The couch in our living room looks out at the front yard, at the street lamp that throws a pool of jaundiced light onto the cracked sidewalk. It's the same couch I sat on the night I promised I would never leave her again. It's also the couch on which my father once collapsed after a heart attack, eyes wide and uncomprehending. Objects in houses collect meaning the way old sweaters collect lint. Watch from the couch, Maya said because she wanted me present but not performing, witness but not actor. She'd already done the heavy lifting, the emails, the texts, the list of people invited to the house that night. Her sister Lena, who lives an hour south. My brother Rob, who looks at me like a history test he can't quite pass, and Richard, the man who was never her father by blood, but who for 20 years sat at our table and told us what to believe. Richard lived 3 blocks away, in the same spiral of town where everyone nodded at him and never asked what he did when he wasn't smiling. He was a man who wore his suits to church on Sundays and took deep, reverent gasps at the hymnals the rest of us barely opened. For the longest time, that made me trust him more than I trusted my own instincts. He brought Afghan blankets when Maya's fever ran high and handed me casseroles when I was too exhausted to cook. He also knew how to make a person small without raising his voice, and in the shadow of that smallness, I learned to look away. When Maya said, "Watch from the couch," I felt the old familiar pull to step back into the role I'd always accepted. Peacemaker, minimizer, the woman who can thread a needle without acknowledging the finger pricked. But there was another part of me, raw and sudden like a bruise, that wanted to stand in the middle of the living room and shake the rafters down. That part remembered the whispers, the late-night calls Maya would make to the bathroom mirror, the way her hands would tremble when she came home from class. That part remembered my own nights of insomnia, my hands folded around the mug that never warmed me, my chest tightening at the mention of that particular laugh, the laugh that belonged to the man who thought he could teach us how to live by his rules. Maya isn't a little girl anymore. She's 22, with a jawline she inherited from her grandfather and a temper I have always been terrified of. She has been in therapy for 2 years, and for 2 years she has been cutting away the cobwebs in her own head. She made lists, people she would and would not speak to, lines she would not cross. "Watch from the couch," she said because this would belong to her. She had practiced what she would say. She wanted it clean, public, a statement that couldn't be drowned in someone else's version of events. "You sure?" I asked because that's what mothers do. They ask questions not always because they want the answers but because the act of asking is a kind of staving off. "Yes," she said, folding a napkin with practiced hands. "Just watch. Be there. Don't step in." Maya's voice had settled into something almost gentle. She wanted me near enough to feel her back relax, far enough away that she could burn the house down if necessary without worrying I'd throw a blanket over it. There was a planning phase I wasn't privy to. text chains with trusted friends, a quiet appointment with a lawyer, a recording device she tucked into the ceramic planter by the window. The town we live in buzzes with the safe small-town noises. A dog that barks in the night, a teenage boy whose car never stops grumbling down our street, the distant hum of the interstate. Those noises usually shielded us from our own private storms. Not tonight. I remember my palms sweating against the ceramic mug as I tried to sleep the week before. The house seemed louder than usual, each creak a potential revelation. I would hear the furnace clink and imagine it was someone else shifting in the attic. I had, for years, been an expert at making things look whole. I ironed shirts that had been folded wrong, patched seams no one else saw, smiled at neighborhood barbecues while asking the question I never answered. How did we get here? There are things you keep because the cost of their disclosure seems higher than the cost of burying them. For years, the cost calculus in my head was wrong. I told myself that to speak was to ruin. That silence, however complicit, would keep the children safe from the public scrutiny that comes with dirty family laundry. I convinced myself I could protect my kids by protecting the image of our family. That delusion lasted until the day I watched my daughter shrink in front of me and realized that my protection had been a slow, corrosive weapon of its own. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I've learned that when certain stories are out, they seem to free other people to speak. Maybe that happens again. The night ahead loomed like a cliff. I found my dress, a simple black that used to make me feel invisible in a way I mistook for dignity, and ironed it with hands that shook slightly. I did the small domestic things because the rituals steadied me. I put the kettle on the stove, wiped the table until the wood shone, set out water glasses. The living room smelled faintly of lemon polish, of the lemon-scented laundry detergent I buy in bulk, of a candle that smelled like pine and guilt. I placed a throw over the arm of the couch where I was to watch. The throw was soft and warm. Maya had always loved that throw. It felt like handing her an actor's prop, comfort for a role she was performing that night, though nothing about the role felt like acting. There was a pressure building in my chest that was less about the act to come and more about everything that had led to it. Decades of looking away, the stories I had told myself to survive, the small betrayals that stitched themselves into the fabric of a life. I could not say whether what I would do that night would make me a hero or an accomplice. I only knew I couldn't stand and watch from the couch and feel my hands folded when the truth poured out like blood into the carpet. She had asked me to watch. I promised to do that. I did not, in my heart, understand that watching could mean choosing which body of truth to hold up to the light. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. Your stories keep me steady. I sat on the edge of sleep that evening listening to the house breathe. I thought about the words I might speak and the ways my voice could betray me. In the morning, there would be an arrangement of people in our living room, and there would be consequences that I could not predict. I folded the throw and left it on the arm of the couch, a signal that I would be there, somewhere between witness and participant, until the moment came when I had to choose. When I tell people where I grew up, they imagine cornfields and a barn. That isn't entirely wrong. My childhood was in rural Indiana, the kind of place where every adult knows every child's second cousin. My mother had been the town's volunteer librarian, a stick-straight woman with a laugh that surprised you if you heard it. My father liked the quiet. He drank in the kitchen and watched TV until the red numbers of the clock burned in his chest. By the time I was 16, I knew how to stay calm during storms, how to avoid the look that meant he had been drinking. I learned that silence could be a form of diplomacy, and later a strategy for survival. There is a particular kind of fear that lives in the space between your skin and your words. It's a heatless, patient thing that waits for you to forget it's there. I carried that fear into adulthood because it was familiar. I found a man named Tom when I was 21. He had a laugh that matched mine and hands that matched nothing. He left the month before Maya was born, a quiet undoing. No fight, no dramatic scene. He simply stopped answering the calls. I remember holding that infant and telling myself stories about strength. That story didn't last either. Richard entered our lives like a dusk, slow and inevitable. He knew how to be helpful in a way that felt like love. He would tighten a loose screw on the back step, fix the leak in the sink, ask Maya about her algebra in a tone that made her beam. He was generous in ways that looked public and palatable. He attended parent-teacher nights and coached Little League, and had a way of asking questions that made you reveal more than you intended. "How are you doing, really?" And then quickening interest when you told him the parts of yourself you'd been taught to hide. The first sign of something wrong came not as a shout but as a series of small, dissonant things. Maya, at 8, stopped wanting to sleep over at friends' houses. She began to eat at odd hours, as if to steady a body that had learned to be on the lookout. She practiced her smile until it was brittle. She invented errands to get out of the house. I noticed sometimes bruises in places that a fall couldn't explain. Once when I asked, she said she'd bumped into the corner of the table. My instinct was to believe a simpler story because simpler stories are easier to live with. I am not proud of that. One winter night, when the kettle was singing and the gas pump meter clicked outside, Maya came into the kitchen with her hair in a tumbling mess and sat at the table without asking. She pulled a sketchbook toward her and drew, with a fierce, buzzing concentration, faces that looked older than their years. Pages and pages of faces. "I didn't want you to have to see," she said, and I realized then that for as much as I had kept her physically safe, food, blankets, doctor's appointments, I had not kept her from damage that didn't leave a visible mark. The thing about the kind of men who hide cruelty behind domestic rituals is that they are very good at apology. They are surgical in how they ask forgiveness. They will buy you flowers when they have made you small. They will make grand gestures because grand gestures sound like penance. Richard apologized often. He apologized in the dark and in the light and in his prayers. He apologized with casseroles and with folded towels. He apologized in ways that made me believe I could continue the ledger of our life without recording the real numbers. And then there are the nights when you wake up and your body remembers something your mind has been trying to forget. For me, those nights came as sharp metallic smells, old cigarettes and the damp must of a closet, mixed with the muted roar of a television talking about nothing. I would lie in bed and count backward from a number I no longer remember, and pray that the sound of my neighbor's car would be louder than the sound of memory. That is how denial nests. In the noises you let become louder than the truth. When Maya was 16, she began to document. She took photos of things, saved text messages that made her skin crawl, recorded conversations when the words started to sound like threats. She taught herself, early and devastatingly, how to transform fear into evidence. She learned that the law sometimes requires proof, and that photographs and recordings could be more eloquent than any testimony. One night, while she slept, I found a small recorder tucked beneath her pillow. My first impulse was fury. How dare she distrust the people who raised her? My next impulse was something else entirely. A recognition that she had been living with a knowledge I had been pretending did not exist. Sitting there in the lamplight, my fingers tracing the plastic edges of the device, I realized that the person who needed protection the most had been practicing for months. The device was a tiny, stubborn thing that said plainly, "I will not be silenced." I should have listened then. I should have gone to the police. I could list the reasons I didn't: shame, fear of scandal, the way our life depended on Richard's social capital. More than anything, I was frightened of the unspooling that might come if I pulled the thread. Families in our town didn't air their dirty laundry. People like my brother Rob would advise the patience of time. People like my mother would tell me to pray. So I made compromises. I turned down invitations to see so-and-so. I let certain conversations sink into hush. I believed, mistakenly, that saving face could save us. Those compromises built up like frost on the window. They made the house colder. They made my daughter smaller. And that, more than anything, is what finally made me break. The complications of love and loyalty are not easy to explain. They are messy and layered. I had loved Richard in the way I loved pattern and predictability. He was a fixer, and fixers have a particular gravitational pull on people who prefer not to be forced into decisions. He had also been a comfort when the world felt like a series of sharp edges. Loving him was not an excuse. Loving him was a prison. I tell you this because when Maya told me to watch from the couch, She was asking me to be a witness but not an intervener. She had rehearsed it. She had scripted the part she would play. For me, that request resurrected every small, shameful choice I'd made not to act in the past. Sitting on that couch would be an act of penance, or so I told myself. But there are moments when watching is not enough. There are moments when silence becomes the loudest kind of betrayal. That night before the meeting, I walked the house like a monument to our life together, touching the edges of things as if I could rearrange history with a hand. I found an old box in the attic, packets of bills, my grandmother's recipe cards, letters I had never thrown away. At the very bottom, in a place I had not reached in years, lay a small reel-to-reel tape. It was labeled in Richard's tidy hand. To Claire. For later. Later had come, whether the tape wanted it to or not. When I held the tape, I felt like a colluder reading evidence from a past crime. The tape was heavy in my hands like regret. I could remember him laughing about how it would be a keepsake, something to prove the depth of what he called our family. I had never listened. I had been too afraid of what the sound might do inside me. That tape was a lying thing. It hid more than it revealed until you pressed it into a player. There are things we keep because we are cowards. And there are things we keep because we hope they might save us someday. The tape, I realized, could be both. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. This next part is where everything changes. The box with the tape sat on my kitchen table for 3 days. During that time I had 1,000 imaginary conversations with myself. Some practical, some cruel. Listen to it, one side of me insisted. If there's proof there, it will make things clearer. Another voice, older and quieter, said, if you listen, you must act. You can't rehearse bravery like a costume and then put it away. I had been in therapy for a year. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Patel with a voice like warm honey, kept telling me that complicity is a kind of trauma. She taught me that trauma is not only what happens to you but also what you do to survive it. I sat on her leather couch and unspooled the history of my quiet justifications until she finally said, Claire, your daughter is growing new rules for herself about being safe. You have the option of living by those rules with her, or continuing with the old ones. The sentence landed like a stone. Maya was meticulous. She had scheduled our living room gathering for a Sunday evening, a time when neighbors tend to keep their blinds up and people are more likely to linger. She had invited specific people, those who could corroborate, those who could hold us when the world tilted. No interruptions, Mom, she'd said when I asked. I need you to be steady. Her steadiness was not brittle at all. It was the kind of ruthlessness that comes from years of self-preservation. I told myself I would watch from the couch like she asked. I rehearsed the facial muscles I would use. Soft, somber, motherly. I practiced being small. Each time I said the sentence out loud, it tasted like a lie. On the day of the gathering, the house smelled like rain. There is a different kind of smell before a confession. It's not the incense of ritual. It is the cold metallic tang of anticipation. Lena arrived early, carrying a casserole and a look that meant she had seen people sheepish like us before. My brother Rob came with the slow, codified worriedness of a man who doesn't know how to love without listing his expectations. Richard arrived on time, his handshake steady, a smile practiced for the eyes of the town. He made a small joke about the weather and complimented the throw on the couch, the throw that had come to be a token in this evening's drama. Maya sat in a chair across from him. She had her hands clasped, as if holding an inner flame between her palms. She had placed a small black recorder on the coffee table, its red light bright like a minor miracle. Guests took their places. The air hummed with the electric charge of people waiting for a storm. You said you'll watch, she said to me quietly, more to set a boundary than to ask for permission. He nodded. I sat down, the cushion making a familiar, slightly hollow sound beneath me. The room, usually warm and chatty during family visits, folded inward like a fist. The first words were hers, and they fell like a stone. I want to say something that I've been carrying for a long time. She spoke plainly, the words lined up like soldiers. She did not cry. She did not sweep her hands. She told them how certain touches had made her body recoil, how certain comments made the world compress, how a hand on her shoulder had felt like a claim on paper she had not signed. She said things I had heard before in fragments, but hearing them spoken with such economy was like being hit with a new currency of pain. Richard's face shifted in ways I'd never seen. It was a person trying on denial, then rage, then a practiced innocence. "I have never," he started. His voice was a house of cards. Maya's voice did not waver. "This is not the first time you've listened to explanations instead of seeing me," she said. "You told me to be grateful for what I had because other girls had it worse. You told me to ignore the things that made me fearful." She was meticulous. She was surgical. "Watch," she repeated, nodding to the couch as if repeating a spell. I watched as she catalogued every little thing she had kept in the dark. Lena cried quietly into her napkin. My brother looked like he wanted to jump up and punch something. Richard's jaw tightened. He was calibrating his performance of hurt. When people try to make a case for themselves in a room full of witnesses, they often reach for narrative control. Richard reached for it with the same delicious calm he had used for years. He recited the times he'd come by with soup. He talked about the times he'd driven Maya to appointments. He used sentiment like a shield. For a moment the whole room seemed to tilt toward him, toward the version of him we'd all been allowed to know. I felt as if the world wanted its old story back, wanted to smooth the edges and pretend the cracks had always been part of the design. Then he said something that took the air out of me. "Your mother," he said, looking at me, "has always been a little dramatic. She's prone to worry. She thinks she knows everything." The sentence landed with the weight of accusation. It forced me to choose between flinching under his judgment and standing for my daughter's truth. My mouth was dry. It felt as if the smell of the throw on the couch had turned into something acrid. I remembered the tape in the box like a pulse in my hand. Something inside me, a new and harder place that had been carved out by late nights and Dr. Patel's questions, said, "Take it out. Play it." It was not a grand decision. It was a small, deliberate rebellion against a lifetime of accommodation. I reached beneath the end table where I had hidden the reel-to-reel tape and set it on the coffee table like a challenge. The old player I had not touched in years sat beside it, its plastic scuffed. People looked at the contraption as if it might be a relic from another era, the way you look at an old radio in a museum. "Claire," Lena said, the word threaded with worry. "What are you doing?" I did not answer. I fed the tape into the player. It felt like threading a time when I was younger and more innocent and more willing to believe promises. Press play. At first there was nothing but a hiss, the kind of white noise that sounds like the beginning of confession. Then a laugh, Richard's laugh, came through, all braggadocio and swagger. "You're so gullible," his voice said on the tape. "They'll never see you. They'll never know what I'm doing. They think I'm their savior. Look at them, falling into my hands like that." It was a memory of him I had avoided. Not the man who made casseroles, but the man who took pleasure in control. The recording captured him like a bug pinned under glass. He was unaware that someone had pressed record, that his speech while he thought he was alone would become an echo used against him. For a long moment there was only the sound of neighbors' muffled televisions and Lena's breathing. Then the room moved as if woken. "Where did you get that?" Richard demanded, his voice losing its steady cadence. He reached for the player. I felt his hand brush my sleeve in a way that was meant to claim, to dominate. My knees felt weak. Maya spoke then, not with the fierceness of accusation now, but with a calmness I had not heard before. "He told me he'd never be caught," she said. "He taught himself to be lovable because love is the best camouflage. I recorded him once when he thought he was talking to a friend. I thought I might need it. I didn't know I'd ever need you, Mom." In that moment, watching from the couch felt like an inadequate prayer. I watched as Richard tried to extinguish the small electronics with a hand that was not as deft as it used to be. He lunged for the player. I stood up before I could think about the consequences. "Stop," I said. My voice sounded like a stranger's, thin, but surprising in its clarity. "Stop, Richard. There was a silence like a held breath. When people have behaved with a certain kind of quiet cruelty long enough, they expect the world to continue to accommodate their behavior. When the world doesn't, they are startled in a way that looks like anger. "You should not have done that," he said to me. His face was a mask of wounded dignity. "You were supposed to be the one who kept things together." I felt a hot flash of something that might have been humiliation and shame and a deep, bone-level anger. "I failed her," I said. Saying it aloud felt like stepping off a cliff. "I thought I was protecting you, and I was protecting something else. I was protecting the image of my life because I was too afraid to lose what I thought I had." There were gasps, and then Lena steadied herself against the coffee table. My brother's jaw had gone slack. Richard tried to speak, to deflect, to charm. But the room no longer hung on his charm. The tape kept playing. More laughter, more casual cruelty, the crispness of a man who had rehearsed his lies. There is a particular physical sensation that comes when you commit yourself to truth. An ache that starts in your chest and radiates outward, as if some old, calcified thing inside you is cracking. My hands trembled. My pulse thudded at my throat. 4 years I had hidden in plain sight. For years I had convinced myself that silence was the least injurious path. Now the silence had been broken, and with it, a chain that held us in place. If this is resonating with you, please do leave a like. It helps this story find others who might need it. The player clicked. The recording's hiss became a chorus of small, damning statements. For the first time in a long time, the sound of Richard's voice matched the way people had felt around him. Small and watchful. He tried to reach for the recorder again, fingers scrambling, but Maya lifted her hand in a way that said, "No." Her hand was steady. Mine was not. "You don't get to decide who tells our story anymore," she said. Those were not just words to Richard. They were a declaration to the town, to the people who had nodded at him for 20 years and taken his side because his smile was easier to hold than anyone's discomfort. The room seemed to expand and contract with each syllable. Then Richard raised his voice in a manner I had never heard. An angry, public, damning voice that sought to reclaim the narrative. "You have no idea what you're doing," he spat. "You're making claims against me with no context. You will ruin people." "Context?" Maya asked, something like laughter breaking through. "The context is that you hid behind kindness when you wanted power. The context is that I lived with fear because of you. The context is my life." The neighbor up the street, Harold, who had come because he had concerns. He'd always been a neighbor who disliked surprises, stood up and said, "If there's evidence, call the police." His voice was solid. The word evidence changed the room in a way that no amount of charm could undo. Somebody had the presence of mind to call 911. I watched the way Richard's composure arrived like armor coming back on. His face folding into a shape that had always protected him. Denial. "He loves this house," he said suddenly, pointing to the photographs on the wall like they were proof of his stake. "He offered to help us. You tried to make everything wrong." At that moment the front door, which had been closed, cranked open. In walked a policeman, a broad man whose presence was ordinary and therefore terrifying. He had been the one dispatched to check the noise. He had probably expected something else. He was not prepared for the personal storm unspooling into his living room. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice neutral and conditioned by protocol. "He's been," Maya began, but I interrupted because I had been in the living room telling myself I would watch and not speak. "He has been saying things to my daughter that he should never have said," I said. "And worse. For a long time." The policeman's notepad scratched. He asked for names. He asked for specific details. The tape, God bless the tape, gave the kind of specifics that someone's memory alone sometimes cannot. With each sentence he wrote, Richard grew paler. He tried to charm the officer, to reframe his behavior as the result of stress, but the officer's face was an expression of someone trying to navigate the delicate terrain between domesticity and something that demanded law. The other thing that happened when truth rises is that other secrets get up and step forward like timid people seeking the sun. Lena told a story I had not known. Her own older boyfriend from high school who had used a similar kind of manipulation. My brother mentioned the times he'd seen Maya look away on family outings and thought it was teenage moodiness. The accumulation of small, corroborating details built a scaffolding around the accusation that no single denial could tear down. At some point, Richard realized that the collective weight of all the things we had smushed under the rug was pressing through. He stood up. The movement was that of a man who had been confident until the rug slid from under his feet. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill," he said. "This is personal. This is a vendetta." "It's not a vendetta," Maya said. The steadiness in her voice now had the texture of someone who had practiced 1,000 private hearings. "It's my life." The policeman, who had taken down names and looked at the tapes, said, "We need to take statements. Sir, we might need to come down to the station." That sentence, simple and bureaucratic, sounded to me like a bell. Richard stumbled, his face a contorted mask between rage and panic. He turned to me with an expression I'd been seeing for years, a plea that I had once mistaken for vulnerability. "Claire," he said, "we can fix this. Talk to them." And in a voice that surprised even me, thin and raw, I said, "No." It was the shortest sentence I'd ever spoken with the most enormous consequence. It was like closing a door I had kept open for a lifetime. They took statements that night. The policeman was gentle in a way that made me grateful to strangers for their capacity to be humane. Later, after he'd left and after Richard had been told he might have to come to the station to answer questions, people sat in the living room like after a funeral, slowly letting air back into their lungs. Lena hugged Maya with a force that made both of them sob. My brother sat next to me and took my hand, not speaking but holding me in a way that felt like a stitch. When the house quieted and the guests filtered out with half-words and promises to call, Maya and I sat on the couch. She leaned into me, shoulder against mine. I could feel the tremor in her body, the residual fear that had turned into a weary resilience. "Why didn't you stop it sooner?" she asked, not with anger but with the bluntness of a surgeon's probe. I had rehearsed answers in my head, excuses tied to survival, money, fear of scandal. But when she asked me, the truth came out simpler than any practiced defense. I was afraid. For years I'd taught myself to be afraid of things I thought more dangerous than exposure. The gossip of a town, the hollowing out of my reputation, the sudden collapse of the life that had been my frame. Now, faced with the rawness of what we had done to our family, the thing I feared seemed childish. I had let fear hold me hostage while my child made her life around it. She looked at me then in a way I'd never experienced, like a new person and also like the small child I'd once wrapped in a towel. "You didn't have the right," she said softly. "But you did get here. You came to the end of the couch. Is this how it gets better?" Yes. The question felt like a baby bird's first caw, exposed and hopeful. "It starts with truth," she said. "Then we make the rest." A few weeks later, Richard was charged. The charges were not all that we hoped. There are legal constraints and evidentiary hurdles. But for the first time, there was official recognition that something wrong had happened. The town talked about it in whispers that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves. Some people turned away. Others offered food and appointments, a kind of practical tenderness that had been missing. If you are still with me, please know that the rest of this story is not a dramatic undoing. It is messy and real. I could have been arrested for interfering that night. I could have been ostracized for breaking a decades-long silence. There were consequences, and there was also, finally, a fracture of the old story. In the months that followed, our house became a kind of clearing where we had to relearn how to occupy space together without the old ghosts setting the schedule. Maya started volunteering at a community center for survivors, her presence a light that seemed to draw other people out. She continued therapy and started a support group on Thursday evenings in my living room. Ironically, the same space where she'd once been asked to be quiet. Those meetings smelled like coffee and old upholstery and the honest, aching talk of people who had been kept in the dark for too long. I started attending the support sessions with Maya. I went because I needed to understand the contours of the damage done by silence, but I stayed because I realized how much my own story mattered to other people. Hearing others' truths made my own confession less monstrous. I told the story of the tape and of the nights I chose to believe a version of peace rather than confront pain. People listened without the kind of moralizing that had kept me silent for so long. There were no easy absolutions, but there was room for repair. Richard's trial was not the theatrical thing I worried it would be. Courtrooms are practical places with forms and schedules and breaks for lunch. He pled not guilty at first, and the legal dance went on. There were motions and depositions and days where I would sleep for 2 hours and then spend the rest of the night going over statements in my head. There were reporters who wanted to package our trauma into tidy headlines. There were neighbors who peered through curtains with a discomfort that saw nothing of the complexity of living. We had to divorce the life we'd known from the life we were trying to create. My brother said, "You did the thing you were supposed to do in the end," and I wanted to push him away for that simplicity. Lena said, "You acted," and I clung to that as a small, strange victory. I am not without regret. Regret is a patient companion. It sits with you in the kitchen while you make toast and asks why you did things when you could have done otherwise. But regret does not equal absolution. It is only a part of the story. The town was split. Some people withdrew because it was easier. Others came forward with casseroles and awkward hugs. We lost some friends. We gained others. My life, once so carefully arranged, began to feel less like a stage set and more like a workshop where things could be mended. I took small, practical steps. I changed locks, I began to learn the dance of anger without violence. I practiced saying no in quieter settings until it became less shocking to my own muscles. Maya's growth was the most extraordinary thing to watch. She began to speak publicly about survival and accountability in a voice that was clean and fierce. She started attending university classes that had once felt impossible, declared a major in social work, and began to see in herself someone who could transform private pain into public care. Watching her, I felt like the ocean, both moved and frightened by the force of it. People ask me now if I would do it differently, if I would have sat on the couch like she asked and let the night be entirely hers. I do not pretend to have a simple answer. If I had stayed silent, perhaps the legal steps would have taken a different path. Maybe the town would have stayed the same and the truth would have settled like dust. But I cannot unsee the look on Maya's face when she was finally believed. There was a relief there that made every sleepless night worth something. My choice that night was less about heroism than about the unbearable weight of watchfulness. I had watched for decades, watched, measured, negotiated. The tape and the subsequent act of playing it were less a clever trick than a clumsy, late attempt at restitution. I do not expect forgiveness. I ask only for a witness to the fact that people can change course even after years of making the wrong decisions. If this story has touched you, please consider subscribing and sharing it. When these stories get out, they give others permission to untie the knots they've carried. There is a lesson in this that is simple and difficult at the same time. Silence often serves someone who wants it. When you are in the position to choose whether to keep quiet or speak, consider who benefits from your silence. Consider the cost of protecting an image at the expense of a life. Consider, too, that telling the truth is messy. There will be losses and there will be pain, but there can be a slow, steady kind of repair that grows out of honesty. I still have nights where fear wakes me. I still fold the throw and place it on the couch sometimes as an old ritual. But the throw no longer represents a willingness to hide. It is now a comfort to be shared in the honest, ordinary kind of life we are trying to rebuild. Maya sits on the couch more often than not. Sometimes she reads, other times she journals. Once in a while she will look at me and say, "You remember to breathe now, right?" And I will answer, "Yes," knowing that the breath is both a small miracle and a daily practice. We are not fixed. We are not free of consequence. But we are, in ways that matter most, moving forward. Watching, for me now, means holding space for truth, even when that truth will break something you once thought untouchable. I did something that night my daughter told me to watch from the couch. I broke a silence so long that it had started to feel like tradition. She will never forget it. I won't either. And maybe that's the only kind of inheritance worth leaving. The knowledge that even the most ordinary among us can choose to be brave when it finally matters.